would you like to address them first?
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Hist for this recognition. It's a pleasure to be here. I spent some time this morning thinking about how to structure this speech, and I thought that perhaps the most interesting and useful way to talk about our fight for justice and Julian's freedom is to put his incarceration into perspective. As you may or may not know, my husband, Julian Assange, is the founder of WikiLeaks, and he has been imprisoned in London since the 11th of April, 2019, because of what WikiLeaks published. The information that WikiLeaks disclosed shook political discourse that had been so carefully controlled by the establishment media in the years after 9/11. Until WikiLeaks came along, it was not a hard task to shape perception. Yes, there were projects that promoted freedom of information. There was the emergence of bloggers. There were bold projects like Cryptome, but overall the establishment media was not seriously challenged by their presence on the internet. WikiLeaks was different. WikiLeaks sought to create a new way of doing journalism and introduced a number of innovations. Firstly, WikiLeaks defined its publication criteria, suppressed and censored documents which were of political, ethical, diplomatic, or historical significance, which had not previously been published. Secondly, WikiLeaks created a new model for reporting, what Julian calls scientific journalism. What did he mean by that? WikiLeaks published analysis, but it also published the original source documents alongside the analysis. This meant that, like the scientific method, the analysis could be tested, expanded on, challenged, and refuted. Thirdly, WikiLeaks broke new ground with its use of cryptography to protect and anonymize sources. Fourthly, WikiLeaks sought to maximize the impact by forming partnerships with other media organizations that would expend resources to contextualize vast data sets. WikiLeaks published documents from all over the world, but it was the leak from a US Army intelligence analyst, Chelsea Manning, that made WikiLeaks and Julian household names in 2010. Whereas WikiLeaks developed partnerships with the most influential papers in Europe and the United States, New York Times, El País, The Guardian, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, etc., to maximize the impact and analytical manpower of the Manning leaks, those partnerships soon became uneasy. The WikiLeaks model of publishing source documents alongside the analysis in the papers challenged the sort of public discourse that those very papers had been involved in shaping. The way that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had been reported on until this point was through so-called embedded journalists who would travel and report alongside US and allied troops. They would live in protected compounds and they would receive information through military press briefings. The content of the leaks was explosive. It was internal data sets from the US military that had been concealed from the public. It revealed the quagmire that the wars in the Middle East had become. For example, WikiLeaks revealed the previously undisclosed death of 15,000 civilians, which the US had been compiling secretly and then publicly saying that they didn't have data for. The cables, for example, the US diplomatic cables that Chelsea Manning leaked to WikiLeaks and that WikiLeaks then published, revealed that Shannon Airport was indeed being used to refuel CIA rendition flights, despite assurances to the Irish public by the Ahern government that Ireland was not involved in the CIA rendition and torture program. WikiLeaks published a video called Collateral Murder, which was the first big publication from the Chelsea Manning leaks in 2010. And I recommend that all of you watch this video. If there's one thing that you do after this talk, if you haven't seen it already, is watch Collateral Murder. Collateral Murder is a video that shows the killing of civilians in Iraq from the perspective of the helicopter gunship that killed them. It's a video through the viewfinder of an Apache helicopter with the audio of the American soldiers who were flying inside the helicopter. And you can see the process of them obtaining what is called permission to engage, i.e. Permission to kill the people on the ground. And these civilians who were on the ground were walking through the streets of East Baghdad, and two of them were actually Reuters journalists who were on assignment. And in this video, you can see how the people on the ground are shot to pieces, literally. And one of them, who happens to be one of the two journalists, tries to reach cover and is crawling on the ground, severely injured, and finds a wall to hide behind. And just then a van pulls up. And this van is actually a van of a man taking his two children to school. And he sees the severely injured man on the ground, and he stops his van. He gets out and carries the injured journalist into his van. And then you witness how the US soldiers then open fire against the van and kill everyone inside except for the two children, who only survived because their father threw his body on top of them and shielded them to a certain degree from the bullets. And these bullets are, very big bullets that are made to pierce through metal. And the children survived, but were severely injured. They were injured in their, the stomach and the head and so on. And they were the only survivors. The WikiLeaks model transcended the traditional scope of journalism, providing archives which historians, academics, and long-form journalists source from to this day. Because these are official documents, they have been accepted as having evidentiary value at the UK Supreme Court. For example, in the case of R on the application of Bancool No. 3 versus Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, and also at the European Court of Human Rights. In the case of Khalid al-Masri, who was a victim of CIA rendition, he was able to use the WikiLeaks cables containing diplomatic communications about his rendition in order to win his case against Macedonia at the European Court of Human Rights. He had previously tried to sue the US government in the United States, but because it was all concerning national defense information, the US courts threw his lawsuit out. The CIA rendition program was one of the most secretive of the post-9/11 era. It involved the abduction and torture of individuals across jurisdictions. In the case of al-Masri, he was abducted, blindfolded. In Macedonia, he was sexually assaulted, shackled, and then taken through a CIA rendition flight to a black site in Afghanistan, where he was subjected to violent interrogations and further torture. After several months, he was suddenly released after it was discovered that he had been mistaken for another man who they were looking for, whose name was also Khalid al-Masri. Julian has long defended the model that he established with WikiLeaks, of the value of providing an archive that preserves the integrity of the historical record. He has sometimes referred to WikiLeaks as the rebel library of Alexandria. In his introduction to the book, The WikiLeaks Files, The World According to the US Empire, Julian writes, "Diplomatic cables are not produced in order to manipulate the public, but are aimed at elements of the rest of the US state apparatus, and are therefore relatively free from the distorting influence of public relations. Reading them is a much more effective way of understanding an institution like the State Department than reading reports by journalists or the public pronouncements of officials. Only by approaching this corpus holistically, over and above the documentation of each individual abuse, each localized atrocity, does the true human cost of empire heave into view. It was this archival aspect of WikiLeaks which allowed one of the men who assassinated the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2019, a Saudi intelligence official by the name of Mutreb, to be identified. His name appeared in a WikiLeaks publication from 2015, and it was only in 2019 when there was a sort of search to try to identify the people involved in his murder, that it was discovered that he was mentioned in one of WikiLeaks publications called Hacking Team. The documents showed that Mutreb had been trained in using offensive spyware technology on behalf of the Saudi state against journalists and activists. Some of you might not remember this, but Khashoggi was killed, I think, this is the anniversary. I think it was 5 years ago yesterday. And he was killed in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul. He was a Saudi journalist who had left. He was in exile, and he was going to get married, and he had to obtain some documents from his embassy. He was in Istanbul, so he entered the embassy, and he was strangled by a 15-man assassination squad. So he had an appointment, he was strangled inside the embassy, and his body was dismembered inside the embassy, and his remains were disposed of. And we know what happened because the Turkish authorities were actually bugging the Saudi embassy, and they had a recording of the whole thing. The one cable that had perhaps the greatest impact of all had been overlooked by all the major media, the initial partners, Der Spiegel, New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, and El País. This diplomatic cable, which was disclosed, which was leaked by Chelsea Manning to WikiLeaks, is called, or has the identifier 06 Geneva 763. It was published in September 2011, about 9 months after WikiLeaks started publishing the diplomatic cables. And it described the execution of an Iraqi family by US troops, including 5 children under the age of 5. A quote from this cable: "Troops entered the house, handcuffed all residents, and executed all of them. The autopsies revealed that all corpses were shot in the head and handcuffed." The cable was published just as Iraq's government was in the process of negotiating the possible extension of the status of forces agreement with the United States, which conferred immunity to US troops and was due to expire on December 31st, 2011. The publication sparked calls for an inquiry by the Iraqi parliament. And soon after, the Iraqi government said it would strip US forces of immunity for civilian killings. 1 month after this cable was published, Obama announced that US troops would leave Iraq by the time this status of forces agreement expired. So this was October, and they would be out by December. No doubt this cable influenced how that negotiation fell apart. Whether or not he knew it at the time, Julian created a project that incarnated Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. And that article reads, "Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers." Article 19 breaks the right to freedom of expression down into three aspects: seeking, receiving, and imparting information freely. The coming of age of the internet did not just allow any person to become, in effect, a publisher by publishing their content and opinions on the internet. It also allowed the act of seeking and receiving instant and practically costless. And the potential audience for one's speech is anyone connected to the internet, the whole world, practically. The power of freedom of information became turbocharged through the internet. And soon that power became recast as a threat, which is what brings me to where we are today. Julian was asked in an interview for the French magazine Philosophie in 2013 what he thought his situation would be in 10 years' time, that is to say in 2023. He replied, "My personal situation depends entirely on the state of the world. If the world evolves in the right direction, if the international community is favorable to freedom of expression, if the conviction that state decisions must be more transparent gains more traction, then my actions will be evaluated and judged in a positive manner. The role that WikiLeaks played in exposing certain war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, or the fact that Cablegate encouraged the Arab Spring since the publication of US diplomatic cables undermined the legitimacy of dictators like Mubarak, Ben Ali, or Gaddafi, will be considered positively. However, if the world evolves in the opposite direction, towards a totalitarian dystopia, where surveillance and control is omnipresent, then I will probably be imprisoned somewhere." We are, in many respects, in the totalitarian dystopia that Julian predicted, evidenced not only by Julian's imprisonment, but also by the means by which the public's right to true information has been reframed as a threat to public safety. A new economy has emerged around the control of information, and censorship on social media platforms has become ubiquitous. When WikiLeaks first published these groundbreaking documents, pundits claimed that the United States would never extradite, let alone indict him for these publications. Although the United States had initiated an investigation against him in 2010 because of the Chelsea Manning leaks, by the end of the Obama administration, Obama had commuted Chelsea Manning's sentence and announced that it would not take legal action against Julian in relation to the Chelsea Manning publications because Julian Assange is a publisher, not a hacker, and that the Obama administration was not willing to bring a case that could then be used as a precedent to go after the rest of the press. It was what the US administration called the New York Times problem. There was no way of bringing a case against Julian that did not criminalize news gathering, speaking to sources, receiving information, and communicating it to the public. The Trump administration, which is the one that brought the indictment against Julian, was motivated to criminalize journalism. And so it used the Espionage Act of 1917 to indict Julian for receiving, possessing, and communicating information not to a foreign state, but to the public. It was the first time that this statute had been used against a publisher. It had been previously used under the Obama administration, namely against whistleblowers or sources, but never against a publisher. And this is where we find ourselves now. Julian faces 18 charges, which amount to 175 years in prison. He has been in the UK's harshest prison of Belmarsh since he was essentially kidnapped, with the complicity of the Ecuadorian government from the Ecuadorian embassy, where he had been granted political asylum, specifically for the purpose of protecting him from the threat of extradition and prosecution in the United States in relation to the Manning leaks. Julian has been in prison for 4.5 years without conviction, while the US seeks his extradition. We have since learned, since his arrest, that a spying operation occurred inside the embassy for the CIA, conducted by a Spanish security company. And it involved recording his meetings with his lawyers, his legally privileged conversations, and that plots had been drawn up on orders of CIA Director Mike Pompeo in 2017 to kidnap, rendition, and even assassinate him. A worldwide movement has come about to bring his incarceration to an end and to drop the case in the United States. Just as Julian predicted in his interview with Philosophie magazine in 2013, Julian's imprisonment has come to symbolize the dark turn that the world has taken after the age of transparency and democratic expression through the internet, which peaked around the time of the WikiLeaks publications. This trend toward information control must be reversed, and the most important step in reversing this trend is freeing Julian. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful address. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that have been pre-submitted from our committee, and then I will open it up to the floor. Firstly, I just want to ask you some questions about yourself. And what made you want to become a human rights lawyer? How did you first meet Julian?
Well, I think I had an early education in justice. I grew up in Southern Africa. I was born in South Africa, and my parents were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle while we lived in Botswana and Lesotho. And during this time, close friends of my parents were assassinated by the South African Special Forces in 1985, so I was just 2 years old at the time, but this event really was a kind of a defining moment in my family's history. And we eventually moved to Europe, and I think that this upbringing where my parents, were involved in not just the anti-apartheid struggle, but mainly the anti-apartheid struggle, really kind of shaped my worldview, and I wanted to continue in the same direction, I guess. Subconsciously, it's just the way I saw the world. I met Julian in 2011, so he had already published all of these publications. And I didn't really understand much about what a game changer it was for journalism. I saw it from a different perspective. When you're a student or you're working in kind of the human rights field, the access to these hidden secrets it's like a treasure, and often victims of injustice are not able to get any redress or recognition, but the emergence of this archive of what had been going on in the background in all these, basically every single country in the world, from 20 I think the cables mainly I'm talking about covered 2002, 2003 to 2010. So this is like a detailed political history of virtually every country in the world, internal analysis, and so on. My first contact with WikiLeaks was through the media, but I understood the greater importance that the model provided in giving access to original source official documents at such a scale. And so I met Julian as part of the legal team that was fighting extradition, but I was also kind of getting educated on what was going on in the background in the United States, because he was, the investigation against Julian in the US actually started soon after Chelsea Manning was arrested. So she was arrested, I think, in May 2010. And so Julian was, you know, basically there was a big push to try to stop him from further publications. And so it was a very difficult environment for him, but you know, he was determined to publish, and so formed these partnerships with mainstream media and got the information out. But the attack on WikiLeaks and on Julian came from many different directions. So, for example, in December 2010, there was the banking blockade that started. And the banking blockade now, I think, has kind of become normalized. At the time, and I say this because, you know, there are a number of alternative media and so on that have been debanked in a sense, and content creators that have been demonetized and so on. But at the time, it had never been done before. This was a form of censorship that was completely novel. And in fact, there was a court case in Iceland, which WikiLeaks won, because the credit card processors, Visa, MasterCard, and so on, had arbitrarily just cut WikiLeaks off from its donor base. And the WikiLeaks model is, it remains independent because it doesn't take money from foundations, and it doesn't take money from advertisers. It's a lightweight publication compared to its impact in terms of its running costs. Less so given all the legal attacks. So there's a lot of, you know, legal fees and servers and so on. But considering the impact that WikiLeaks has, it is an extremely efficient publication if you compare to, I don't know, a newspaper, a traditional newspaper. But when WikiLeaks was publishing the Chelsea Manning leaks in 2010, the support was overwhelming from the public. They were getting a lot of money, something like $100,000 a day right at the peak of it. And the average donation was $25. So you can just imagine the amount of support there was. And then so that's why there was this completely extra-legal decision to cut WikiLeaks off from its financial lifeline. And that was December 2010. And it was very controversial at the time, but it continued. This PayPal, MasterCard, Visa, and so on just stopped processing donations to WikiLeaks. So this was just one of the many aspects in which Julian was under attack. And obviously there was reputational attacks that started almost immediately. And because of this breakdown in the relationship with some of the partners, which was almost inevitable because the way that WikiLeaks went about publishing was put it on a collision course with the media that saw its role as more of a gatekeeper or wanted to maintain its relationship with, you know, with the establishment and so on. so there were reputational attacks on that front and so on. But that was the context in which I met Julian, where he was under attack from multiple fronts. And I joined his legal team in 2011, so that's, 12 years ago now.
And of course, he's currently in Belmarsh, which is a Category A men's prison. Could you tell us a little bit about what his living conditions there are like, his access to medical care, to the outdoors, etc.?
Belmarsh is a very harsh prison. It was built in the early 90s. It's got a court right next to it, so the initial hearings were in this court, and they would transport him in an underground tunnel that was, they advertise it as a kind of bomb-proof tunnel with a vault in the middle, and it's all very, they really like talking about how high security a prison this is, which it is. Julian is in a single cell, which is some 2 by 3 meters. He spends over 21 hours a day there. He can go out into the yard for up to an hour a day. The yard is a concrete yard with mesh overhead and barbed wire, kind of razor wire on the sides. And this actually, the EU, well, it doesn't matter anymore because it's not part of the EU, but the EU has regulations that you're not supposed to have this razor wire, but Belmarsh does it anyway and pays a fine that they have to pay every year for keeping this razor wire. So it's a very harsh environment that he's in. And isolation is the norm really in Belmarsh because, it's not like the movies where you see prisoners really kind of interacting most of the time and then it's nighttime and they close the cells. In Belmarsh, it's all the time, it's the norm. Everyone eats their meal inside their own cell. They keep interaction to a minimum just because it's more... I think the reason is that the guards don't want to deal with any conflict, and so it's just easier to keep people in their cell rather than, maybe fighting in the corridors. So that's the norm. Of course, Julian's never, he's not a violent person. He's never had any violent... There's no allegation that he's a violent person. He's a writer, he's a thinker, he's a thoughtful person, and he's in this very violent place. We estimate that about a third of the people on his wing are either accused or convicted of murder, and it's very strange to have someone like Julian in a place like that. But I think it's also it's a prison where prisoners are transiting through. They're either awaiting trial or waiting to be transferred on to where they will serve their sentence. So Julian's the person who has been in his wing for the longest, and there's about 60 people in his wing. So it's also a difficult environment in terms of the people around him are constantly changing. And of course, the prisoners conceal why they're actually there. Sometimes you know why they're there. Sometimes they say that one thing and then actually it's something else because there's a report that reveals they were actually They're actually in there for something far worse.
And how often are you able to visit him?
I see him about once or twice a week. Yeah.
I suppose WikiLeaks itself is an organisation that comes under fire for lots of different things from people all along the political spectrum. Of course, predominantly with publishing videos of US soldiers in Iraq, to like emails between the DNC and Hillary Clinton, and you know, allegations that it's become particularly partisan in the last few years, and particularly since 2016. How do you respond to kind of such criticism of WikiLeaks as an organisation?
Well, the way Julian has expressed it is that WikiLeaks is not the type of organization that says save the whales. It puts the information out there for you to be able to decide whether you want to save the whales or not. And this kind of agnosticism around information, where the only criteria is that the information has to be true, obviously puts Julian in the crosshairs for all sides. He was the darling of the liberal kind of left, as in the US Democrats, while he was exposing the Bush wars. And then in 2016, WikiLeaks published these DNC and Podesta publications. And look, it's quite simple. In 2016, there was a primary between, namely Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. And just like there was this surge in populism on the right, which boosted Trump, there was also a surge in populism on the left, which was boosting Bernie Sanders. And in fact, the polls were showing that if Bernie Sanders would run against Trump, Bernie Sanders would win the race, would win the election. But the polls also showed that if it were Hillary Clinton who represented a kind of centrist establishment Democrat vote, that if she were running against Trump, that she would lose. And this was already clear before the end, before the Democratic candidate was selected. In spite of this, the Hillary campaign and the Democratic National Committee allowed the primary to be rigged. And it's not just basically the DNC had a secret agreement with the Hillary Clinton campaign, and this was also revealed not only by WikiLeaks, but Donna Brazile, who later took over the DNC, revealed this in her book, that there was a written agreement between the Hillary campaign and the DNC that basically gave her the nomination. And look, it's really serious. It was the DNC basically defrauding the Democratic donors who were supporting Bernie Sanders in the belief that they were supporting their candidate and that he had a chance to win fairly the primaries. But it was rigged against him, and you see in the DNC publications how the Clinton campaign was basically briefing against Sanders and telling media organizations not to interview him and so on, using their influence, which was, of course, extremely significant. Hillary Clinton had built a strong influence over many years, and so the primary, the Democratic primary, was rigged in favor of Hillary Clinton. And then there was another aspect, which was the Clinton campaign, in spite of the polling and all the information available, decided to boost Donald Trump. And this was what I think it's in the Podesta emails, what they called sorry, it's out of my head right now, but there's a document in the Podesta emails that shows that the Hillary campaign was asking the media to give Donald Trump more space in their interviews, basically boosting his visibility, because their calculation, in spite of all the information and all the polling, was that Donald Trump was too extreme, and that the Republicans, the centrist Republican vote, would go to her if Donald Trump was the candidate for the Republicans. This was a huge miscalculation. But this is what led to the Hillary campaign boosting Trump, telling the media, their media contacts, to give Trump visibility. And of course, everyone knows what happened after that. So the defeat of Hillary Clinton at the 2016 elections was due to Hillary Clinton running a completely disastrous campaign. She didn't bother to campaign in the key states where he swung the vote. And then, aside from the fact that, Bernie Sanders would have won if he had run, it was completely misreading the climate on the ground of populism, which Bernie Sanders appealed to on the Democratic side. And as a result of this, the Clinton campaign had to blame someone. They didn't blame themselves, obviously, even though all the evidence is out there for people to be able to analyze it. Instead, they blamed everyone else, and especially WikiLeaks, claiming that exposing corruption, exposing the Clinton campaign's corruption in relation to the 2016 election somehow made WikiLeaks and Julian partisan. But that's all it was. It was showing the reality and actually informing the public, which is why the DNC tried to sue WikiLeaks and Julian in relation to these publications. And the lawsuit was thrown out. This was in New York, the Southern District of New York. The judge threw it out on First Amendment grounds and said that the 2016 publications were, in fact, of the highest public interest, that you couldn't find a more relevant instance of than this, in which this publication was informing the electorate ahead of an election. And obviously it caused a certain faction of the Democrats to get very angry.
Absolutely. Your campaign to free Julian has attracted a huge amount of support from a variety of different political figures, figures like Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, Lula da Silva, lots of others, and that's just to name a few. But it has attracted support from some much more controversial figures, like Russell Brand, George Galloway, Vivek Ramaswamy, who has described the climate change agenda as a hoax, who has described the LGBT movement as a cult. All of these people have been reposted on your social media at different points. Do you believe that support from some of these figures could alienate people from Julian's movement? And do you think that it can give further platforms to their own ideas and their own politics that maybe a lot of people in this room might not agree with?
It's true that Julian has support from all sides of politics, and I see this as a strength, not a weakness, because it means that people can converge on some very basic issues, and these basic issues to do with freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to know the truth. This has to be a pillar on which everyone agrees. And look, I'm a free speech advocate, and I consider it to be a sign of hope that there are things that I can agree with people who I profoundly disagree with on other issues. But look, I mean, the reality is that I think we need to push for more openness and dialogue, and not less. And that's why I hope that freeing Julian and the greater significance around his imprisonment is something that everyone can agree on, and then from there, let's disagree. Disagreement is the kind of essence of an open democratic society. I have lots of friends with whom I disagree on many things, and I would be very bored if I agreed with everyone on everything all the time. So I think obviously we're at a point in history where free speech is under threat. But the way to fight back is not by letting some people speak and not others. That's a very dangerous place to be in. And what I've found with the support that Julian has is that I've become a lot more, it's opened my eyes to, there are a lot of different people out there that come from very different places and see the world very differently because of the way they grew up or whatever. But that doesn't make them bad people or there's kind of this, as long as you can find decency and humanity and compassion, that's what we should encourage. And I'm fearful for a kind of mob culture that has emerged. It's very dangerous. So I think free speech is the lesser evil, and that it should be encouraged and not be feared.
And do you have any hope, I guess, for the future of journalism, for the future of the press? What do you think the steps that are necessary at the moment to get a truly free and fair press?
Well, I think the freedom of the press really is, the future of freedom of the press really depends on what happens to Julian's case. Because if you see, I didn't really go into it in this case, in the speech, but the case of against Julian is absolutely scandalous. So, as I said, he's accused under the Espionage Act, but he's not accused of espionage per se, as the kind of thing that you think of when you hear espionage. what the US alleges is that he received information from Chelsea Manning and he possessed it and he published it to the public, and that by communicating with his source, he entered into a conspiracy to publish information to the public. There's no allegation that this wasn't public interest information. There's no allegation that Julian was acting on any other motivation or for anyone else's benefit other than the public's, right? So here you have the purest expression of journalism, of important, hard-hitting journalism being criminalized. Then you have the fact that Julian isn't a US national, he's an Australian, he was in the UK, has nothing to do with the US. It's one thing if you indict and prosecute a US national who was working for the US government who out of an act of conscience decided to leak information to a journalist. I'm not saying it's right, but I'm saying that it's a completely different case to indicting a journalist who received the information, let alone a journalist who's outside of the jurisdiction and has no connection to the US, you know. It's like saying that, you know, that Irish journalists have an obligation to keep Saudi secrets. It's absurd. But that's the case the US is advancing, that Julian is culpable for disclosing this information that Chelsea Manning leaked, even when that information contained evidence of war crimes. So what the US has done is bring a case that, sorry, now I remember that. The strategy to boost Trump by the Hillary campaign was the Pied Piper strategy. So if you search for Pied Piper Podesta emails, you can see the email where they lay out, like, this is who we have to boost, the three more extreme Republican candidates that they thought would lose the election, including Trump. Sorry, back to this. So the case against Julian is completely preposterous, really. And what it does is advance this idea that there is no press freedom, really. That if one country can apply its laws extraterritorially and say that anyone, anywhere in the world is subject to its laws, its criminal statutes, its secrecy statutes, then what is there to stop any other country from doing the same? Say Turkey, and say, well, you know, this Irish journalist who published something about Turkey that we consider to be, you know, classified or whatever. Well, now you're going to be put in a Turkish prison because that violates our laws. It's absurd, and the fact that Julian is facing extradition is a concession by the UK, effectively, to say that that US secrecy laws indeed do apply in the UK. It's kind of surrendering sovereignty, and not only that, but like puncturing the press freedom of the UK by saying, well, we're accepting this carve out in relation to what we can publish here after the fact, because now that we're extraditing someone who is publishing from here. And of course, this kind of surrender of sovereignty doesn't just concern the UK. the case against Julian, the extradition case, may well end up in the European Court of Human Rights, and it will really test the scope of press freedom within Europe, because if they agree that Julian can be extradited, then essentially they're saying that U.S. criminal statutes, the U.S. Espionage Act applies to anyone in Europe. And of course that's what the U.S. government is trying to achieve, to intimidate the press to not publish information that the U.S. doesn't want revealed. But of course isn't just U.S. information. I mean, it's U.S. documents that revealed the killing of civilians in Iraq. Do the people of Iraq not have a right to have this information? Does the public not have a right to know about their victimhood? You know, about U.S. State-sponsored or state-covered-up criminality? Of course we do. So it's really an attack on the press, and Julian's case is in fact being used as a kind of new standard on prosecuting journalists. So you have actually a video that went viral in a couple of years ago. You can watch it on Twitter or YouTube. It's the president of Azerbaijan who is interviewed by a BBC journalist, and this BBC journalist asks him about the state of press freedom in Azerbaijan, mentions some dissidents and some journalists who are imprisoned, and then his comeback is Julian's case. And he says, well, what are you doing to Julian Assange? Are you not killing him mentally and physically? He's in a prison for what? For publishing information, you know, and that's not something to be celebrated when the president of Azerbaijan is basically using Julian's incarceration as a shield and a justification for his country's own excesses. And similarly, you know, other countries mention Julian's case whenever they're confronted about the imprisonment of journalists. Just the Democratic Republic of Congo was asked about a Reuters correspondent who's been arrested, and they mentioned the imprisonment of Julian and also the arrest of a French journalist who has recently been arrested and raided in relation to her reporting, which is quite similar to Julian's case. Her reporting was about French intelligence giving information to Egyptian authorities about finding, locating activists and so on. And now she's being raided because that's national defense information, right? So it's basically created a new standard and made journalists everywhere more vulnerable and at risk and actively being imprisoned, because Julian's case shows the world that there is no press freedom standard. If even the countries that are most vocal about press freedom are doing this to the most visible and celebrated publisher in relation to documents that literally revealed civilian killings and assassination squads and war crimes, then anything goes, really.
Absolutely. And finally, just one last question. What would you say to anyone here who would like to support Julian and who wants to be able to do something themselves to support his movement and his freedom?
Well, I think the most important thing is to be informed and involved. I have something called the Free Assange Emergency Toolkit, and I'm on Instagram and Twitter, or X as it's called now, And there's obviously, well, I know students don't have money, so I won't ask you to donate. But I think for you, the most important thing is to really understand what's at stake and to remain involved, to come to the protests when there are protests, know that this is a global movement to free Julian. This is there's never been a movement like this one. I mean, every single day there is something happening somewhere. And it's from the smallest scale of like someone in a small village somewhere going to the town square and you know, like marking out the size of Julian's cell, 2 by 3 meters, and saying, you know, with a sign saying "Free Assange," to the president of Brazil at the UN General Assembly just 2 or 3 weeks ago, who used his address to the General Assembly hall. And as you know, the General Assembly meets every September. It's all the, you know, all the countries, and they come together once a year, the heads of state, and Lula, who was one of the first speakers, the second or first, used his address, which was something like 7 minutes, and he talked about Julian, and he said that we cannot have press freedom attacked in this way, and that Julian should be free. And what happened? Well, this hall full of all the leaders of the world, you know, the presidents and so on, there was a spontaneous applause. And this doesn't happen much in the UN General Assembly. Everyone, you know, gets their time, they talk about whatever is important to their country. You don't get this kind of spontaneous applause from the hall, but that's what happened when Julian was mentioned. And you can watch it online. And that shows that this is truly when you have a global grassroots historical movement, when you have it from at such a small like grassroots level and also at the highest level. You can be a part of that movement, and it's also empowering, and it's empowering in the sense that, you know, it's the most important, significant political case of our times. And when you become part of a movement like this, you also meet fellow travelers who have, as I said, a similar outlook on this really important issue. And that doesn't mean that you necessarily will agree with them on everything. But it's also really interesting for me. It's been personally very interesting to meet people that are so different, but who are generous in spirit and understand the humanity and the injustice of the situation. And I think that's also something that's very attractive about being part of a movement like this.
Thank you so much for all those great answers. I will open it up to the floor now because I'm sure lots of people have questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming in. I was wondering which the best presidential candidate do you think has the best chance of restoring integrity and transparency to global institutions? We're on the next section.
I'm not very optimistic because, look, I think where things are at now is there's a movement against transparency. And not only is there a movement against transparency, there's a huge economy against transparency. There's a huge economy on to control information. You know, there are all these think tanks and NGOs and, people like you are going to go into the job market, and there's just all these funds that have been made available for projects to control information, right? There's a whole economy around this. And there are lots of incentives to keep it going. There is some pushback, but for example, the Twitter files, this was a really important revelation about how the US institutions, government institutions, were interfering with the First Amendment. So you have to see, in the United States they have the First Amendment, and the First Amendment is much stronger than the kind of protections that you get in Europe. It is actually something that protection from government restriction. So it prohibits the US legislature from limiting free speech. This is really strong, right? It's not giving you a right. It is ensuring that your right to speech isn't limited. Of course, the Espionage Act is seen from a constitutional perspective completely unconstitutional. But what the Twitter files revealed was that US institutions were behind the scenes in communication ongoingly with Twitter and, of course, other social media companies to basically restrict speech, to shut down accounts, to limit their visibility, etc. This should have been the biggest story around. And yet it was barely recognized by, for example, the New York Times, Washington Post. It was a non-story. And why is that? I think there's just there's so much complicity in this new kind of censorship regime. It's become really normalized, and that's because there are much more effective tools now than there were 5-10 years ago to control speech and to restrict speech, and that's just so tempting for the authorities. It's just too tempting. It's too tempting. And so I don't think, even though there might be some candidates who are, kind of running on a ticket for free speech and who did talk about the Twitter files, I think once in office, I don't think this can be reversed, frankly. I think it's just too pervasive. And Europe has completely bought into this as well. So I'm not optimistic.
Actually, in relation to what you were saying about the Twitter files, there are certain efforts to censor social media in the aim of stopping fake news or protecting children, such as the UK online safety. And in your view, what are the effects of governments working with social media companies, and how do you think the governments might impact your work?
Look, this whole safety, the discourse around safety is just a way of introducing censorship. The Online Safety Bill, Act, in the UK in the UK is a total disaster, and the fact that there wasn't significant pushback against it just shows the lack of understanding and I think there's just been so much buy-in into the censorship regime that it's just it wouldn't. There was this kind of push about 10 years ago, and it failed, and now we're just really far along. So the question is, so what do we do about it? And I think we just have to come up with alternative venues. We have to become educated in. There are projects to create structures that are censorship resistant, and I don't think we'll be able to reform the social media companies. I think we just need to learn to use different tools that are decentralized, platforms that have a different approach, that might require a little bit more technical understanding, that are not as easy to use as Instagram, for example, but that value freedom of information more. And hopefully, progressively, people will learn it will become more widespread because more people will understand the problem and realize that there are areas in which you can that are not, subject to the control of who knows who, and I think that's an area of optimism, actually, that as people realize how much our regular communications are being controlled and restricted and so on, that more people will be encouraged to find other ways to communicate.
I'll take one final question, I guess.
First of all, well done, Stella, for being so strong. Really,
Thank you.
Boys and everything. I know that there's this BX that's coming up soon, and I was thinking, what do you think of the idea that because of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks being such a special case, and because of the nature of information and information being released affecting everybody, not just any niche campaign, do you think it's a good idea to make some special appeal to all campaign groups, just by nature, just because this is so new, because it does affect everybody, and also because a lot of these campaign groups around the world are I don't know what to say, lifestyle, and a lot of people are kind of doing their own background causes for a long time. But with Julian Assange, time is an issue. So I was thinking, is there some kind of special appeal that could be made to broaden the base of support, because at the moment it's kind of, we don't know what it's going to go to. And also, I wanted to say as well, because you're a lawyer, just following the case yourself and knowing that cases can be thrown out on technicalities, right? Murderers get set free and all that, we all know that. My own amateur list is that this guy Torgerson died. Let me see the spy plot. There was an assassination plot against Julian, right? All of this is public. All of the allegations coming from Sweden dropped, right? I believe Julian was denied access to his legal team, or denied access to his files as well at some point, I'm not sure exactly. And the US also admitted in court, that actually, I don't know who admitted it, someone from the military admitted actually no American lives were put at risk. huge, like abuses of the legal process. So can the whole case not be thrown out from that aspect? You know, I mean, it's very blatantly pernicious. And also, I had an earlier today, if you don't mind. For ages, I know the DEA campaign and everyone were focusing on defending Julian and defending journalism. What do you think of the idea that instead of constantly defending this, that actually we again broaden the campaign by actually, again, if a word I would say counterattack, or attack their attack by proposing radical new laws or something like that, something broader like that, that will strengthen journalism and in the process free Julian Assange. Like, counter the attack with a broader attack, you know? I don't know what form it would take, but...
Okay, so day X is the day of the public hearing. So Julian's extradition case has now reached a stage where he, after 4.5 years, the High Court in London has refused him permission to appeal, which is in itself quite extraordinary, right? Because you have a case that all the major free speech human rights groups say is of the highest importance, that has very grave implications for journalism everywhere. And yet the High Court doesn't even want to hear his arguments. He's now going to try to get that decision reviewed by a panel of 2 judges. The good news is that there's going to be a public hearing, and on that day we're asking everyone to go out on the street in London or wherever you are, hopefully here in Dublin as well, to show support for Julian in front of the Royal Courts of Justice in London. And the issue is that we don't actually have a date, so we've called it Day X to get people ready, you know, get ready for Day X, so people know what's happening. Of course, the case should have been thrown out. It should never have even proceeded. But then, after Julian's arrest, all these things started coming out. The spying on his lawyers, because there were whistleblowers in Spain that had worked for the security company that was actually working for the CIA secretly, and they said they were recording Julian's meetings with his lawyers. They got instructions to get the DNA of our 6-month-old baby, and so on. And then this big story came out in September 2021 that Mike Pompeo had ordered these plans to assassinate Julian. And Mike Pompeo basically confirmed it and said, well, all the sources, and there were over 30 sources for that story, they should all be prosecuted under the Espionage Act, thus confirming the authenticity of the information, and the CIA has declined to comment. So obviously, any kind of right-minded person would agree that you can't possibly send a person to the country that has plotted to assassinate him, and yet here we are. He's not even able to argue that point in court, according to the High Court, because he's been denied permission to appeal. The important thing to understand, though, is that this is not a legal case. It's a political case. If it were a legal case, then we wouldn't even be here. And obviously there is a lot of room for counterattack, but right now all our resources are on defense, defending Julian. And I hope that, people understand that the priority is to free him. And hopefully with his freedom, other things will flow directly, because the trend that has been set of putting Julian in prison, that can only be reversed and countered if he's freed. And that's where we are at the moment.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for answering everyone's questions, including my own. We really appreciate you taking the time to come to Dublin, especially given everything at the moment that you and Julian are both going through. Thank you so much.